Hi, welcome to Tabs 2 Cents. Today on the show, we have Marc Cortez. Marc is the founder and CEO of Liquidate Water Conservation Company, and he has a ton of firsthand experience in the EV and renewable energy industry. Today on the show, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about energy, we're talking about water. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Tabs 2 Cents, the show where we discuss multiple income streams and macro factors affecting the world today.
Hey, Marc, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I thought we could just start out with a little introduction about yourself, just so the listeners know kind of what you've been up to.
I've spent a couple of decades now in renewable energy, focused primarily on solar energy, some early stage EV infrastructure back when we had infrastructure but no actual vehicles to charge. So it was really early stage. And then some energy storage, utility scale energy storage companies and projects. So I've been around the energy and specifically the clean tech energy space for quite a long time. I have a startup company you can see here called Liquidate here in California. We live and breathe the drought every day. So I'm trying to bring some of the financial concepts we used in renewable energy, similar to carbon offsets. I'm trying to do that with water conservation to try to incentivize companies and people to save water. And then I've written a book, and I'm also an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship here in California State Polytechnic University in San Luis Obispo. So I've been around the clean tech space for a long time.
And you like to discuss climate change at times as well. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that.
It's a hot topic these days, not no pun intended, but right, it's you can't even pick up a paper or any article. Every single day there's some news about the climate, and it's a very hot topic of conversation amongst a lot of people. Certainly with during election years here in the U.S., it's always a big hot topic of conversation. So I, from having worked around it for a long time, I've been a consumer of climate science for decades, and certainly with my experience in installing some of it and putting it out there into the world, I have some opinions based on just the combination of those factors. So that's what I started. And then as I was talking with some of my students here at Cal Poly, I was noticing the effects of some of the, for lack of a better way to call it, just the scare tactics that are being used. And I took some personal responsibility for that because I spent so much time in the industry trying to avoid exactly that. And so I started to have some discussions about what's the truth, or at least in search for the truth. What do we know? What do we not know? Are we off base? Are we on base? Where are we exactly in the climate discussion? And that's what sort of led me down this path.
Where do you think we are, and what do you believe to be? Because for me, I know when I first started looking into this stuff, I didn't realize there was such a controversy and so far, far to this side, far to that side. Some people don't necessarily think that CO2 is doing anything. I think generally what the consensus that I gathered was we all know the planet is warming, but we don't necessarily know what is causing it and whether our actions are having any impact on that. I wonder, what's your opinion on that?
The one thing that we know for sure is that it's so polarized. Here on one side you have the alarmists, is what I call them, which is, hey, we're all going to be dead by Thursday because of climate change. And then you have the denier side, which is, hey, there's nothing to see here. Let's just keep moving on. And of course, the answer is somewhere in between. CO2 is a natural gas, but it's also something that we add with our energy uses and our consumption. So, our temperature is rising. It looks like it by, a degree or maybe, just below a couple degrees over the past couple hundred years. Has mankind had some effect on it? Some. It's not the direct lever that you'll sometimes hear about, but the real story is somewhere in between. And so when I set off to write this, I set off really to just investigate it, because there was a lot of narratives that were out there that I said, these kind of fly in the face of what I knew my own experience to be. So I said, I just want to dig in there, because I just want the truth. I want to know what's really going on. And it's been a daunting journey to try to get away from the two extremes. I'm not on either side. I spent 23 years in the solar business and believe that it can be part of the solution, but I also know that it's got some severe limitations. And the idea that we're going to solarize the world and then save the planet is actually kind of a ridiculous one if you think about it, because it's intermittent energy and developing nations, they don't want something that works when it wants to work. They want something that's reliable and cheap. And so there's all these narratives that kind of conflict. And one of the biggest challenges is, you're not really allowed to have a dialogue about it. People are so entrenched in what they believe that you can't even talk to people about it. In my own business, when I talk to people in the solar business, you're not allowed to question it. You just have to forward this idea that we need more and more and more of this stuff. And it just doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit right, especially when you're starting to see the results like, a whole generation of scared kids that are scared because we've told them to be scared. And man, that's just uncool in my book. Scaring kids is not a good outcome. And when that happens, I feel like I need to stand up and start questioning things and having other people question. So I think that's the way that you said it is a great way to summarize it. It's somewhere in between. And that's why I called my book Journey into the Muddy Climate Middle, because right now it's been these two extreme sides, but we're not making tremendous progress on it from any country standpoint. No one's making great progress. And a lot of misinformation, a lot of dollars being spent with not very much effect happening. And so I believe that it's a problem that we should address directly. I believe that it's something that it's important, but I also believe that most people don't know what the real truth is or how bad it is or could potentially be. And so that's what really set me down on my journey. So I believe the answer is somewhere in between where, look, we've got 8 billion people on the planet. We know that we're having some effect on the earth. That's just logic, and science can support some of that. But the idea that we're all heading towards climate disaster is fiction, and it's completely untethered in science. And so that's also fairly shocking to me that we've allowed this narrative to take hold that really is not based in grounded, what we would call typically empirical, provable science.
I think that's a good summary of kind of what's going on. From what I can tell, I'm not a scientist. I don't understand the stuff at the scientific level, but I do know that fear sells a lot of the time. And I know that fear gets clicks and attention. So you're going to get a lot more clicks and opportunities to showcase your articles if you're going to say something like, oh, the world's going to burn tomorrow. More people are going to look at that. For whatever reason, we like to scare ourselves. And it's interesting that you mentioned the intermittency of renewable energy for like solar, for example, because one thing that I've heard a lot is that if we could perhaps store this energy, as I know you're in a storage business as well at one point, we could perhaps send it back into the grid. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about energy storage, where we're at now, and how far we actually have to go to have a grid that works with the intermittency of renewable energy.
Whether or not it's solar or wind or any intermittent generation capacity, then the way that you fill in the gaps is you store it. And so right now, the primary way that we're doing that is with the burgeoning lithium battery business, but that's just in its infancy. I know California has some of the biggest installations that there are, but that's a heck of a lot of batteries. And right now we don't have anywhere near the global capacity to not only mine all of that lithium, but to build the batteries. And then of course, we're at the very beginning stages. So we don't know what happens when the batteries at the end of their lifetime. Now, what do you do with them? So, anyone who thinks that solar or wind or batteries are clean should probably watch how they're made, because it's similar, like with everything. The first thing that happens is you fire up a big tractor and go mow down a mountain and extract all the minerals from it. And with lithium, it's going to be times a million, right? So I think our ability to satisfy our energy needs with batteries is just microscopic compared to what we need. It'll be part of a solution. I believe that we need the whole portfolio approach to managing this. There's nothing wrong with having solar plus wind plus storage plus a bunch of cleaner alternatives onto the grid. It can certainly help over the longer term, but there's no magic bullet here. I think it has to be deployed where it's appropriate. So I'll give you an example. Here in California, there's such a mad rush to do all this, and so got to have more solar, got to have more storage, and let's just replace everything with those two, with solar and storage. Well, we also have 2 nuclear power plants, which has the cleanest footprint from a CO2 perspective of all of that, and they are both scheduled to be decommissioned. One is San Onofre down in San Diego, One is Diablo Canyon, which is up actually close to where I live. So San Onofre is being shut down, and they're going to replace it with solar plus storage. And if you do the math, and this is not scientific math, this is simple addition. We're going to increase the CO2 footprint from that San Onofre generation capacity by about 600 to 700%. So we're actually making the problem a lot worse, because you're replacing something that's really clean, nuclear. Most people don't think of it that way, but nuclear is one of the cleanest energy sources we have. And then you're replacing it with solar plus storage, which are hundreds of percent dirtier from a CO2 perspective. So, and we're doing it just because we're so panicked about it that we feel like we have to do something. And so the second plant, Diablo Canyon, that they were getting ready to shut down, they said, well, maybe we should reconsider this. Maybe we should, maybe it's not the complete answer to everything. So they've actually voted to keep that plant open for a few more years, because there's all kinds of downsides to that too. So I think this blind rush towards spending lots of money and just throwing all these solutions out there are just having all kinds of negative effects. So they're not having the good effects that we think that they're supposed to have.
I can't take credit for this thought, but I read somewhere somebody said, if we've discovered fission today, we would likely be jumping in there claiming we solved the climate crisis, because it's a low CO2 emitting energy. Like there's no CO2 in the actual fission process. It's just, building the plant and all of those things. A little bit misplaced to go after nuclear in this moment. And a big reason why I like to look at these, major macro factors is because from an investment point of view, for example, we have this ESG movement going on. Everybody's piling into solar and they're piling into wind. But as, funding starts to get a little bit more stringent and the microscope starts getting tighter on these industries, some of the lithium mining production, for example, they might start losing some of that funding, and it might move over into something like nuclear. So when you take a look at the big picture and from an investment perspective, what kind of industries do you think we should be looking at moving forward?
I get into these discussions sometimes, and people will say, well, this energy source, this is a better value than this and that. And every energy source is economical if the government underwrites it. So it's sort of this weird argument where, like, for example, people say, hey, Teslas are already cheaper than X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, no, they're not, because every Tesla has $20,000 to $30,000 of public money just slapped to the side of it. It's our money that we're paying for it. So, and that money's not going to poor people. That money's going to rich people who can afford Teslas. So right now people are chasing the government-run investment dollars because we're just pouring money into these things. So I think the investment world rightfully follows that money and says, well, who cares if it's right or wrong? I'm not saying that they all say that, but let's follow the investment money. And if the government is underwriting it, then that is just one more risk factor that gets lowered for them. So I totally get it. I understand that completely. It's the question becomes that I always ask is it really having the effect that you want? Is giving every Tesla $20,000 to $30,000 of public tax money? Is it doing anything to lower temperature? Is it having any effect on CO2? And is it a good spend from the public standpoint? And those are different questions than whether or not the investment makes sense. So, with most large utility scale solar projects, I think most of them, if you lay it out over 20 years, most of them make a pretty good rate of return. But there's a whole cascade of incentives, tax credits, rebates, and things like that go into that enable that. So it's hard to single out one factor and say, well, this makes perfect financial sense. But to your point, I think everyone's chasing the government-run ESG dollars, and so those things will, as long as the government's pouring billions and trillions of dollars into that, I imagine that the investors will also do the same thing.
Sometimes it's about the flow of cash rather than the legitimacy of the movement. I do wonder sometimes with electric vehicles, the thought that I had was, is it possible that they're incentivizing these vehicles so much because they have a greater plan to use those batteries, our own personal vehicle batteries, as a backup storage system for intermittent power?
I mean, that sounds like a pretty interesting solution. I think it remains to be seen. I think like here in California, where we have the most electric vehicles, that people keep saying well, hey, if we have more electric vehicles, then we could prevent blackouts. And I'm kind of the opinion of, okay, show us, prove it. So right now, I mean, it looks great on paper, and this is one of the big challenges with the climate is most of it is a spreadsheet exercise. And when I say spreadsheet exercise, is you've got a bunch of really smart people and looking at numbers, and they look into the future and they say, well, here's a bunch of bad stuff that could potentially happen in the future. And so if you just move the pieces around the chessboard and make those future stuff look potentially less bad, there, we've solved our problem. And it's just sort of this funny math. I call it in my book, I call it climate accounting, which is just you take credit for bad stuff that potentially you're avoiding in the future. You're taking credit for that today and act as if you've made things actually better when you haven't. So to your question, can it work? Sure. Is it working now? No, not even close. And so are there enough vehicles out there that can potentially make a dent? No, there's not even anywhere near that in order to be able to have the grid use it. But it's an interesting concept. I think you're starting to see a couple of companies that are starting to do that, saying, turn your Ford F-150 EV truck into an energy storage system for your house, which could make a lot of sense. So I would love to see it. If it's going to happen, I would love to see it as a regular solution out there.
Something that I kind of found interesting with the whole movement was that, and I'm not sure the grid could support it anyways if they were trying to take energy back into the grid, but maybe just for each household, they could use it as a backup, as you say, to avoid blackouts. Just something else that I was sort of wondering with the climate. I've done a lot of work on carbon credits,
Yeah.
and I've seen some plastic credits out there. And I know your company works with water conservation credits. It just got me kind of wondering, like, what, in your opinion, is actually affecting the climate? Because it's possible, if we move forward, we find that perhaps CO2 isn't doing as much damage as, say, methane or, some of these other gases that are just like sulfur hexafluoride or whatever that one is, that it provides this major greenhouse effect and warming. Perhaps there's some other industries that I could be looking at that could get those incentives, as you say, from the government once they start to learn what's actually having a greater impact.
That question goes into the heart of, is mankind changing the temperature complexity? Are we the main culprits, or are we the main cause of global temperature rise? And so that is a complex question. And I say it should be very straightforward based on all the work that's out there, all the narratives that are out there. That should be something that, that you can look up and just find an immediate answer to. Sure, there's tons of science that supports that. And what I found was the opposite, that it's not that way at all, that that is still being fundamentally debated. How much of an impact is CO2 of man-made CO2 having on the environment? For thousands, actually not thousands, for millions of years, it was actually the opposite. Before mankind ever came about, CO2 rise followed temperature rise. So think about that. It's the exact opposite. And then once we got involved, and once mankind started burning stuff and adding our own levels of CO2, science flipped that. And they said, well, now that we're here, all of that stuff is now opposite. So now CO2, we think, is causing temperatures to rise, even though for the entire history of our entire planet, it's been the opposite. And that was sort of fundamental. So at some point, we think that it flipped, although there's really no evidence that shows that. And there's not a scientific basis for that. So I look at it sort of as a sliding lever. There are times when, if you talk to the true believers in this, they will say CO2 is the main lever of rising temperatures. If you talk to other people on the right, they'll say it has no effect whatsoever. The answer is somewhere in between, and we don't really know. And there's not science that shows direct cause and effect. Even here's what was surprising for me when I was reviewing a lot of this stuff. If you read what you read in the media, if you read the standard New York Times and Washington Post and CNN, it's unequivocal. That's the word I always hear. It's unequivocal. Mankind is causing the planet to warm at a deathly speed. And like, I go to the government websites, even the EPA itself, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, on their website, it says very clearly, we can't really prove that CO2 causes temperatures to rise. It's really extremely difficult to prove that. So wait a sec. If the people whose job it is saying that, is just admitting that we can't quite be sure that that's doing that, then how is that a scientific given? So it's pretty difficult, and it's a really difficult and muddied picture of how this happens. So to answer your question, if all of a sudden we find out that CO2 isn't the culprit, how can any of the other man-made gases be the culprit? If that's truly the case, how could methane or any of the other four, supposedly toxic man-made chemicals, how could that be the main driver? If we've been following and chasing CO2 for decades and that proves to be false, how can the other ones, using the same logic, how can the other ones be the main fault of that? You have to say, the Earth's natural cycle is by far the primary driver of climate change, and we're just along for the ride. You'd have to come to that conclusion. So, but again, I think from an investment standpoint, that's not going to happen anytime in the next couple decades. You can't see that, because that would mean a whole bunch of people were really wrong about this stuff, and the chances of that suddenly happening are probably not that great. So I still think that the investment dollars are going to be flowing into where they're flowing. We're not going to do a sudden switch on what we think the potential solutions are until we've had enough information that shows that maybe they're not working as well as we think they should.
I agree. It's going to be a hard task for anybody to try to turn around their opinion on that, especially they're fully committed, it seems.
Yeah.
On both sides. It would be hard for somebody to come out and say, you know what, you were right, CO2 is warming the planet. We need to go full renewables. And then on the other side, somebody to say, you're right, CO2 isn't warming the planet. We've done this all wrong. We can go back to coal. No big deal.
Well, and so on that point, I think let's assume, and what I do in my book is you can't really prove that causation, but let's just where our logic has here. Chances are pretty good that CO2 is heating the planet. There is some science that supports some of that. So let's assume that it's a big deal. And I do believe that we are having an effect on the climate, and that burning all this bad stuff is certainly not helping. And so it's, CO2, just having CO2 go into the atmosphere, unmitigated is not a good thing. So that leads you to the next step, which is, so what are the answers to that? Well, replacing bad energy sources with potentially less worse energy sources is also not the answer. Replacing a coal plant with a bunch of solar or windmills isn't making CO2 less. It's making potentially future CO2 less worse. But the net effect, like today, if you went and installed a solar system on your house or a building, you have added CO2 because solar has a CO2 footprint. So total CO2 will have gone up. You didn't remove any because it doesn't remove CO2. So every energy source that goes out there and gets added to the grid increases total CO2 levels. It's just true. So if we really, let's all of a sudden say the world is so concerned about CO2 that we have to stop it and start to lower our total CO2 levels, renewables doesn't do that because it just continues to add. It just slows the growth of it. It goes from this much of a ramp of CO2 levels to this much of a ramp. It's like the joke I use in my book is saying, if you're trying to lose, let's say you're 100 pounds overweight and you have a 20 donut a day habit. So renewables is like dropping that consumption down from 20 donuts a day to 5 donuts a day, and then giving yourself credit for 15 donuts a day worth of savings. It's that sort of logic, right? You're still 5 donuts a day fatter. And so with all these other additional energy sources, we're still adding more CO2 sources to the grid. And so if we do have to get really concerned about CO2, then we have to start removing it. We have to start literally just taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. You can't just slow it down and expect somehow for the entire total to go down, because it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I am curious to know, in your studies, did you find any research that would kind of analyze the cradle to grave, megawatt to megawatt for various energy sources? So for example, 1 megawatt of solar energy, what's the carbon footprint of that? Cradle to grave, when you think about the production, the mining of the minerals, recycling after the fact, transportation to where it needs to go, in comparison to 1 megawatt coming out of a natural gas plant, for example.
In fact, I have a chart in there in my book. And so, coal is by far the worst in terms of the amount of, it's something like 1,700 grams per kilowatt hour. And then gas is down to about 800. And solar is about 40 to 45, depending on where it goes, grams of CO2 emission per kilowatt hour of production. Wind is a bit less than that. Nuclear is down like 14 or 15, right? So it's about 3 times less than solar. And hydro is the least, which has about 11, but that has some geographic constraints as well. So there's a whole hierarchy, but and EVs, are EVs. So depending on how far you drive them, so it's a whole continuum. It goes, coal. I'm not a defender of any particular energy source. Coal, just burning coal and spitting it into the sky, of course, it's not good. Is there a way to make it better? Is there a way to capture the carbon from that? Probably. And would it make some sense? Sure. But there's a whole continuum. But there's what I always push against is there's no such thing as a green energy source. It doesn't exist because every energy source adds CO2, every single one of them. It's not their fault. They're not built to lower CO2. They're built to produce energy. And so in that transition from one physical shape to something else that produces energy, it's just physics. It changes, and you make CO2 with it. So there's a whole hierarchy. But on the spectrum of things, I'd say solar is maybe 4th or 5th best. Windmills are, I think, 4th. But nuclear and hydro are just way down at the bottom. They're the cleanest.
That kind of brings me into the next topic. When you think about climate change, obviously it can interrupt water supply for various parts of the world. I know in California, as you say, you guys have had your issues. And something that I was reading about was nuclear desalination. And I wonder if you think that could be an option, because you build a nuclear plant, it's providing you energy. Any surplus of energy can be used to clean the water. I think that could be something we see in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Near the second nuclear plant that I just told you about, called Diablo Canyon, there's a big push to put desal in there as well. I'm not close enough to desal, so I don't want to take any hardcore opinions about this, but of course, it seems to make logical sense. I have heard that the removal of all that salt water has a bunch of environmental impacts as well. So if you're just spitting that brine back into the ocean, there's a wildlife factor. And so I don't know enough about it. I hear from people in the water business, they don't love it. So it feels like there's a step change technology that's needed to really make it not only economical, but technically feasible and less corrosive, for a better way to say it. So I've heard about it just like yourself. I don't know. I'm not that close to it to be able to have a strong opinion about it one way or the other, but I know it's being pursued. And I think we have the perfect geography here to attempt to do something like that, because we're in the middle of ag country. We have lots of energy use, and we have severe water problems.
So where are we at with water at the moment? What's the sort of leading technology to get fresh water, and what are some of the technologies on the horizon?
My company's called Liquidate. I latched onto the financial engineering components that came from the solar business, because I believe that these financial, there wasn't a lot of innovation in solar. Solar is 50, 60-year-old technology. It's pretty boring stuff. But the real innovation came with the financial stuff on the power purchase agreements and the ways that you could financially stimulate energy demand and production and things like that. So I was a believer in those concepts. So I'm bringing those into water conservation. And my assumption initially going in was it's all part of the energy continuum. But water is very different in terms of, if I thought that old style electric utilities were old school, water is way old school. So super conservative. Getting water from point A to point B is a really big deal. As you can expect, it's mostly political. People will fight, the top of that mountaintop over there. If you're 5th down on the water table of that, it's all, it's just a pecking order. And so it's a very old school way of thinking about water. So I don't know that we're solving it with technology. I think we're looking at different ways to store water, to capture it. In California, the good news is starting to put some financial mechanisms in to have people save water, to penalize people who they think are overusers. And so we're starting to get that, which I think is good. I think putting financial incentives and penalties onto anything will at least get people's attention to change their behavior, or at least make them aware of how they use water, because water is pretty much forgotten. We don't really think too much about it until we have to turn off the spigot, and then it's a really big deal. But I don't see, I see desal technologies, but they still seem to not be able to uncover or get over the hurdle with the the environmental brine issue on the back end. So I think incremental progress, but nothing that is really a game changer so far.
I think that's really interesting how you say water is forgotten, because you're right. I turn the tap on and it's there. And I think it's very similar to turning the lights on. And in Europe, for example, they're dealing with their energy crisis, and they're starting to see what that can look like, and what a world that doesn't have free flowing energy and a surplus and cheap, reliable energy, what that looks like. And it does seem like, from what I've read, and here we are at fear articles again, but we could get to a place like that in the world with water. Where are we at with water right now? Is there still a surplus? Are we good for a decade, or should we really be starting to look at this a bit closer?
I think on the West Coast, it's been part of our DNA for so long that, we draw most of our water from the Colorado River. But, I think probably the truest statement about water is we're just increasing demand because more and more people are coming and moving around Arizona, New Mexico. We're starting to give more people access to the Colorado River. So water saving is becoming a much bigger deal. And, it's a concern. It's definitely a concern. I don't know that we've come close to cracking the code on this. We're still trying a bunch of different things. But at the end of the day, conservation is going to have to be a big part of it. Being aware of it, using less water, putting some financial incentives for both saving, but also penalizing those who use too much, and really just continuing to be diligent about that. I don't know that, the other thing I found out about, with electricity, the metering infrastructure is pretty good. You can actually get a lot of really good data about how much energy is being used. Not so with water. Really, it's amazing to me. Smart meters, very small minority of the population, certainly commercial or residential, have dynamic information, technology that can provide meter reads and things like that. It's still guys in mopeds going around reading meters. And that's phenomenal to me for such an important commodity like water. So the metering infrastructure is lagging so far behind. A lot of it we're still just guessing at. We're still just guessing at how much water there is that's being used. So that's been one of the challenges that we've had in trying to put this out there is, how do you get accurate water usage information? And you're starting to see more companies. We know of a couple of companies that are using retrofit water metering devices that strap onto your water meter and can provide that electronic interface, but it's still few and far between. It's still in a very big minority.
These companies that come in and install smart meters, for example, they could be creating a similar credit to a carbon credit. Sometimes I know your company does that as well with the water conservation credits. I'm just curious how some companies could get those, or what they may do if it's a similar kind of landscape as carbon.
Yeah, there's a company that was started here actually right by some students at Cal Poly called Flume Water, and it's literally just a strap-on box that you strap onto your home water meter, and it is able to detect how much the flow coming through that main water valve, and then they have an app and it makes it readily available to you. So you're starting to see more products like that. My company uses that data. That's where we start, is we get the data. Right now we can either get it from some automatic systems like that, or we could actually go from companies' utility bills and pull it off that information in order to create credits and sell those to other companies to sort of have a community approach to saving water. But that's, as this infrastructure evolves, I think you're going to start seeing more of that, having communities band together to help save water. You see, it's been around for a while already. Actually here in San Luis Obispo, because we've had such a slow growth development approach to things, we'd have new developers come into town and say, hey, I want to build 200 homes here. And the city would say, well, great. You got to show us how you're going to find enough water for those 200 homes. And so they were pretty creative. They went through and they said, all right, we're going to go and we're going to retrofit all of the toilets in homes in San Luis Obispo with low flow toilets. And they paid for it themselves. So they went door to door, ringing doorbells, and hired plumbers to say, we will replace your toilet for free with low flow toilets. And then they added all those things up, and they went to the city and said, okay, we replaced the toilets of 1,000 homes. We've saved you from having to provide that water. Give us the permits, and it worked. And that's essentially the same sort of concept. We've kind of run dry on that approach now because all of the toilets, everything has been retrofitted already. So we're kind of now looking for other options, but it's been used before, so the concept can work quite well.
I know with carbon, with their credits, they have to be additional
Yeah,
reductions.
yeah.
So I'm assuming it's kind of a similar regulatory framework where you can't just say, well, I put in this low flow toilet when they already had one.
One of the interesting things about the water market is similar to carbon, which is there's really two markets. There's the regulatory market, which is the government setting regulations and setting thresholds and giving you basically a budget to meet or not meet. And then there's the voluntary market, which is just, you do it outside of any regulatory framework. Right now, we don't really have either of those in California, or there's not a regulatory framework yet to do that. So we're approaching the voluntary market. We're saying there's a lot of value in company one, buying companies 2 through 10 water savings and being able to manage the entire watershed in that certain locality. Doing it completely without regulatory, what's the word I'm looking for, oversight, I guess, without having the regulatory environment needed to do that. And I think that's where, assuming that this works, and I think it will, I think that's where the real power of this, because then you really get to democratizing water. You get people changing their behavior, changing their company's behavior towards some common goals, and that's a pretty powerful thing.
For sure. I think that's really interesting, and I like kind of diving into different worlds of water and carbon, and plastic credits are another thing that I think could have some potential moving forward, especially like, as I said, possibly we find that the effects on the reef and all these things are maybe more so due to plastic than carbon.
Yeah.
You could see some funding flowing into those kind of programs. And
I haven't heard of plastic credits, but when you said that earlier, it's a similar concept, and I think it's fascinating. I think these kinds of mechanisms can work. I know that there's been a lot of fraud and there's potential for greenwashing and all that kind of stuff. But my view is, once you make people responsible with their money, things change. It's just been true. This is not rocket science, right? If you affect people's pocketbooks positively or negatively, stuff changes. And so I always look at it from that standpoint. If you want people to change their behavior, pay them. To me, the best policy from the government, don't incentivize them to buy more stuff like we're doing now with all of these new incentives. It's just consumption expansion. We're just paying people to consume more stuff, which is how we got into this problem in the first place. If you want to save CO2, pay people to save. Pay people to use less stuff. And the more you save, the more money you make. I think it's just, we're doing things from a backward standpoint. So I love the idea of plastic credits. I think that's a great idea.
Same here. I think that if you can incentivize whatever it happens to be as far as environmental impact in a good way, people are going to do it. They're going to pay attention at least. And, I know for me, like I don't know nearly enough about climate change to make a decision one way or the other. And I'm frankly surprised at how much debate is ongoing with this, because as you say, we should know this by now. And the more I look, apparently we don't. But I'm just like, for me, I just follow the money. I'm like, if carbon offsets are going to be the thing, then I'm going to go invest in there. And, water, though, does seem a lot more straightforward, because if you conserve water, then you're going to have more. It's just kind of black and white. You know what I mean?
Unless you can figure out a way to make more water, that's a whole different thing.
For sure. So yeah, with that being said, I think this has been a great pod. A lot of great discussion here. Certainly giant macro factors that we really need to consider.
Yeah.
But also we brought it down to the smaller world of water and where you work, obviously. So I appreciate that, because it's always nice to speak with somebody who's an expert in their field. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to let anybody know where they can find your work, or perhaps some of your content and your book.
Oh, sure. The name of my book is called Climaturity, A Journey into the Muddy Climate Middle. So climaturity is a word I made up, of course. So a mashup of climate and maturity. You can find it on climaturity.com or find it on Amazon. It's actually just came out with it's a Kindle and paperback, but also an audio version of the book too. I found a great voice actor who did a great job with it and made some scientific talk even sound interesting and digestible. So I was happy with that. And I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn, just various posts about energy policy and things like that. So I always love a good discussion. I believe that we have to be doing exactly what we're doing, which is having an open discussion, but we also have to be willing to be wrong about this. We can't be so entrenched that we just do the opposite of things, even in the face of all this flying evidence. And I know people might yell at me for saying that. Well, we know that we're killing the planet, and so you should be changing your opinion. But my opinion has come from years and decades of working in this industry, where it's a lot of this stuff just doesn't sound right. So I think that the only way that we can solve this is, I'm a big believer in bipartisanship. I don't think any climate policy works without both sides supporting it here in the US, maybe 3 up there in Canada. I think you need all people on board because it's a global problem. And if only half the world wants it, then it'll never make any progress on it. So I view things like what you're doing here as very germane to helping solve this entire problem.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I think that just having an open mind to issues in general is probably the best way to go. That's what I try to do. I'd like to listen to both sides because you never know. And if you get stuck on one side, then you may never find the real truth. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for coming on the show and really appreciate your feedback.
Thank you so much, Joe. Take care, and I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no worries.
Joe is not a financial advisor and may have interest in the stocks discussed on the show, so do not take any information included within this podcast as a recommendation or formal advice. Thank you.